Welcome to the Neurokrish Immersion. In this episode, we are talking about Luria's brain and we'll address conflict, meaning, and the human mind. This is a kind of podcast masterclass because we're going to cover so much ground in this episode. A man destroys his marriage in a moment of rage and spends years regretting the 10 seconds of emotional surrender. A woman knows alcohol is destroying her life, yet she returns to it night after night. A brilliant student lies awake at 3 a.m., exhausted, desperate for sleep, while the mind continues rehearsing catastrophe after catastrophe that could happen when the exams take place. A grieving husband reaches for the phone to call someone who died months ago. An intelligent young man slowly begins to believe strangers are watching him. That coincidences carry messages, that the world has become changed with hidden meaning. And somewhere in all this lies one of the oldest questions in human history. Why do human beings struggle against themselves? Why does intelligence fail in the face of emotion? Why does the mind fracture into competing forces? So that you can sit with it, let me ask those questions again. Why do human beings struggle against themselves? Why does intelligence fail in the face of emotion? Why does the mind fracture into competing forces? Let's sit with those questions, shall we? Today's episode begins not with a modern neuroscientist, but with a Russian physician who walked through military hospitals filled with shattered brains during the Second World War. A man who realized that the most devastating brain injuries were not always those that paralyzed the human body. Sometimes they altered judgment, personality, emotional control, humanity itself. His name was Alexander Luria. And perhaps more than anyone else, he taught us that the brain is not a machine of isolated parts. It's a dynamic negotiation, a tug of war between instinct and restraint, emotion and regulation, urgency and meaning. This is Luria's brain. Alexander Luria was born in 1902 in Kazan, Russia. To understand Luria, we must understand the world into which he emerged. Europe was in intellectual revolution. Freud had begun exploring the unconscious. Behaviorism was rising. Neurology was becoming increasingly anatomical and reductionist. The brain was being divided into compartments. Speech here, movement there, memory somewhere else. But Luria resisted this fragmentation. He was fascinated not merely by symptoms, but by human beings. Unlike many neuroscientists of his era, Luria was deeply narrative. He believed the brain revealed itself not only through laboratory testing, but through stories, through personality, through behavior, through struggle, through adaptation, through the lived experience of injury and recovery. His great books, The Man with a Shattered World and The Mind of a Mnemonist, read almost like literature. One explores a soldier whose world disintegrated after catastrophic brain injury. The other examines a man with almost limitless memory who became trapped by it. Even here, Luria was teaching something profound, that the brain is not merely a machine for cognition, it is the architecture of human experience itself. Then came war. Thousands of injured soldiers, penetrating head injuries, frontal lobe destruction, aphasia is the loss of language, behavioral collapse, emotional dysregulation. And as Luria observed these men, he began noticing something deeply unsettling. Two patients could possess identical intelligence, yet one could no longer regulate behavior. One could no longer restrain impulses. One could no longer function socially. Some retained memory but lost judgment. Others retained speech but lost initiative. Others became emotionally explosive, distractible, impulsive, childlike. Suddenly, the brain was no longer simply about movement and sensation. It was about personality, morality, selfhood, meaning, why, civilization itself. And from these observations emerged one of the great ideas of modern neuroscience. Human behavior does not emerge from isolated regions. It emerges from dynamic functional systems. Systems constantly interacting, balancing, regulating, negotiating. Now, in the world of modern neuroscience, this all seems very, very normal to us. But we need to think about a time when we did not have the kind of information available that we have today. And indeed, modern neuroscience later discovered this through networks, connectivity, predictive processing. Luria proposed that the brain organized human behavior through three broad functional units, a very revolutionary proposal at that time. Not rigid compartments, functional systems, and importantly, these systems do not work independently. They constantly influence one another. And human consciousness itself depends upon this coordination. The first functional unit that he describes regulates arousal, wakefulness, vigilance, attention, and activation. And anatomically, this involves our brainstem, the reticular activating systems, the autonomic pathways, the deep arousal networks. And if you put a finger to your neck, there's the spinal cord right in the middle, and that goes to the brain. And the part that connects the spinal cord with the brain is the brainstem. Most of us rarely think about these systems until they fail. A patient in delirium, a patient in coma, a profoundly fatigued and depressed patient unable to mobilize thought itself. Suddenly we realize that cognition requires energy. Consciousness itself is biologically maintained. Before we can think, the brain must first awaken. And indeed, even today, one of the first rules that we say in rehabilitation is that the person needs to awaken and be accessible in order to be rehabilitated. The second functional unit receives, processes, analyzes, and stores information. This is the unit that we talk about most often in the Neurokrish Immersion. It involves the temporal, parietal, and occipital systems. And these regions help us understand language, recognize faces, perceive space, store memory. But here is where things become deeply interesting. Human beings do not passively record reality. We interpret it emotionally, selectively, meaningfully. A grieving brain perceives the world differently from a joyful brain. A traumatized brain scans for threat. An anxious brain overpredicts danger. A paranoid brain assigns excessive meaning. Reality therefore becomes emotionally colored perception. Deep within the temporal lobe, and I often say this, draw a line between your ears, and right in the middle is the hippocampus on either side. Traditionally described as a memory structure, but it does something far more sophisticated. It constantly compares present experience, past experience, and expected experience. It's a comparator, a prediction system, which means memory itself is dynamic. And this explains to us why trauma is so powerful. The traumatized brain no longer experiences the present neutrally. The past contaminates prediction. The future begins to feel dangerous even before danger appears. Nearby lies one of the most important structures in emotional neuroscience, the amygdala. Popular culture often calls it the fear center. But this is far too simplistic. The amygdala determines salience, importance, emotional relevance. One neuroscientist beautifully described it as the point where cognitive representations acquire emotional significance. Let me repeat that for you. The point where cognitive representations acquire emotional significance. Do sit with that. In simpler language, the amygdala helps decide what matters. Why one memory becomes unforgettable. Why one face becomes beloved. Why humiliation echoes for years. Why trauma burns itself into consciousness. Why ordinary stimuli can suddenly become terrifying. But emotion alone cannot sustain human life. Imagine a world ruled entirely by instinct. Hunger without restraint, sexual desire without boundaries, fear without regulation, rage without inhibition, immediate reward overpowering long-term consequence. Human civilization depends upon another system, the frontal lobes. For decades, the frontal lobes were misunderstood because injury there often produced no paralysis, no blindness, no dramatic sensory loss, and they were therefore called the silent lobes. But this misunderstanding produced one of the great tragedies of 20th century medicine, the era of lobotomy. Tens of thousands underwent destructive frontal procedures because physicians underestimated what these regions actually did. And yet, the frontal lobes may be the very architecture of human restraint. Then came one of the most famous neurological stories ever told, that of Phineas Gage, a railroad worker in Vermont, 1848. He was caught in a railway construction accident. An iron tamping rod blasted upward through his skull, destroying large portions of the frontal lobes. Astonishingly, Gage survived. Before the accident, he had been reliable, disciplined, socially appropriate, emotionally stable. Afterwards, he was impulsive, profane, emotionally volatile, socially inappropriate, unable to restrain himself. His physician, Dr. John Harlow, famously observed, Gage was no longer Gage. Modern neuroscience now recognizes multiple frontal systems, each shaping different aspects of human behavior. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is our executive office. Planning, working memory, sequencing, cognitive flexibility, long-term thinking. Damage here creates disorganization and apathy. And if you're following the visual guide to the podcast, you will be able to see the structures that I'm talking about and the systems that are working here. The orbitofrontal cortex, on the other hand, is our social regulator. It integrates emotion, reward, impulse, and social judgment. It helps to inhibit inappropriate behavior. And damage here produces disinhibition, impulsivity, inappropriate humor, and emotional explosiveness. And indeed, this is one of the areas that was terribly destroyed in Phineas Gage, as you will see in the image of the tamping rod going through his eye into the skull. The medial frontal system is the architecture of motivation itself. These systems help to initiate behavior, generate drive, sustain engagement, and when profoundly damaged, patients may sit awake but unable to act, unable to initiate movement, speech, or intention. And this teaches us something humbling. Motivation is not merely character. This particular situation where a person sits unable to develop intent, unable to be motivated to do something, is called abulia. It is a severe form of apathy that we see in brain injury. And indeed, Professor C.D. Marsden, one of the most celebrated neurologists the world has known, he published a paper every 13 days of his working life. He is unfortunately no more with us, but he described what's called the golf test. And how this came about was, we were asking him, how do you describe abulia? And he said, I always think of a patient who used to be a very avid golfer. So when he retired, he bought himself a house which faced the golf course, and his dream was to spend a lot of time playing golf. Yet when he got afflicted by Parkinson's disease, he developed abulia because of the Parkinson's disease, and he would sit in his front veranda watching the golf course, but he was not able to get up and go and play, and hence the golf test came into being. And in the same way, I often have patients' families tell me how the person sits in front of a television and cannot even change the remote, can't be bothered to change the channel to look at something else other than what is playing in front of him. And that is severe loss of motivation and intent, what we call abulia. And now, of course, we arrive at the central idea of this masterclass, the idea hidden quietly within Luria's work. Human beings are not governed by a single unified force. We are negotiated systems. The limbic brain pushes. The frontal brain restrains. Emotion generates urgency. The frontal systems evaluate consequence. One says, act now. The other says, what happens next? And from this dialogue emerges behavior, morality, personality, civilization, and at times suffering itself. Think for a moment about ordinary daily life. A harsh email arrives. The limbic brain mobilizes instantly. You feel anger, you feel threat, you feel emotional salience. Then the body changes before thought even appears. Your heart rate rises, your muscles tense, your cortisol surges, your attention narrows. And if all that went unrestrained, you would send back a nasty email, or indeed you'll set off to go and find the person who sent that email to you and attack them. But no, but that's when your frontal systems function well. Another voice enters you. Pause. Don't send that reply. Think about consequences. This feeling will pass. That moment is civilization occurring inside the nervous system. So this tug of war, the limbic brain, which is evolutionary ancient, it is what you share with a rat. Survival is required. There is rapid threat detection, territoriality, attachment, mating, reward seeking, vigilance. That's how that part of the brain is wired. A creature that paused too long before reacting to danger did not survive. And that is why your limbic brain is so reactive. But human beings evolved into something extraordinary. The capacity to delay impulse, to imagine the future, to suppress immediate reward for long-term meaning, to subordinate instinct to abstraction. In many ways, civilization itself may represent the expansion of frontal regulation over limbic urgency. And yet, we can never fully eliminate the limbic brain, nor should we, because without it, there is no passion, no love, no attachment, no urgency, no creativity, no meaning. One of the most elegant ideas in behavioral neuroscience is this: healthy human behavior depends upon dynamic equilibrium. Too much limbic activation and behavior becomes impulsive, emotionally flooded, addictive, aggressive, chaotic. Too much frontal restraint and life becomes rigid, emotionally constricted, over controlled, sterile. Now, if you just pause for a moment and think about the people you know, you will remember some who are impulsive, more limbic in the way they are. And you'll remember others who are too controlled, who are too deliberate in everything that they do. In the first group, you wish they could restrain themselves a little better. These are the people we say, oh, I wish they had better filters. In the second, we wish we could shake them into a little bit more of reactivity, little more of spontaneity, little more of impulse. And truly, therefore, for most of us, it's not a perfect balance. Either our limbic brains tend to overtake our frontal brains more often than not, or our frontal brain is so strong that it completely suppresses what our limbic brain is doing. And if you find this curious, my thought, I want you to go back and look at the podcast, The Woof in Your Brain, in which I have described a very limbic dog and a very frontal dog, a basset hound contrasted with a German shepherd. And that tells you the story of this balance that Luria described. Human emotions may feel psychologically distinct, but beneath them lie overlapping brain systems. The same limbic structures participate in fear, love, grief, anger, attachment, pleasure, and even spirituality. But the balance of activation changes. The networks interact differently. Emotional experience therefore becomes very, very different for each one of us. Anger is among the most biologically powerful emotions. At its core, anger is mobilization against perceived threat. Frustration, humiliation, injustice, all this provokes anger in us. The amygdala rapidly detects salience. Hypothalamic systems activate autonomic arousal. Adrenaline rises. The body prepares for confrontation, your fight, flight, or freeze moment. In evolutionary terms, anger protected territory, anger protected status. Anger, therefore, has great evolutionary meaning. But healthy anger requires frontal modulation. The frontal systems ask, is this reaction proportionate? What are the consequences of this reaction? Can this emotion be redirected constructively? And when frontal restraint weakens, rage emerges, violence, impulsivity, emotional hijacking. The limbic brain overwhelms regulation. Think about road rage, a trivial incident. Someone cuts across traffic. Suddenly there is shouting, pursuit, aggression, irrational escalation. Why? Because emotionally salient threat temporarily collapses reflective restraint. The person does not become unintelligent, they become limbically dominant. Anxiety, on the other hand, is not simply fear. Fear is immediate, it's what you feel. Anxiety is anticipatory. It's the brain projecting danger into the future. Modern neuroscience increasingly understands anxiety through predictive processing. The anxious brain persistently overestimates uncertainty and threat. Neutral stimuli become emotionally charged. Bodily sensations become catastrophic. Ambiguity becomes intolerable. A delayed message becomes rejection. A headache becomes a tumor. A silence becomes abandonment. Importantly, anxiety is not imaginary. The body genuinely changes when you're anxious. Your autonomic nervous system, the part of your nervous system that works on its own and connects the brain with your internal organs and controls them, gets activated. Muscle tension rises, sleep fragments, gastrointestinal systems destabilize. How many times have you had to go to the bathroom when you became anxious about something? For example, just before a viva or just before an exam. Your attention narrows towards danger. The anxious person is not inventing symptoms. They are living inside a nervous system that is preparing continuously for threat. Depression, on the other hand, is often misunderstood as sadness alone. But profound depression is far more than sadness. It is altered salience, diminished motivation, disrupted reward processing, emotional exhaustion, cognitive slowing, negative prediction. The depressed brain begins to interpret reality through hopeless expectation. The future feels emotionally unavailable. Reward loses intensity. Some neurological patients teach us this dramatically. Individuals with medial frontal damage may appear awake, conscious, capable of movement, yet profoundly unable to initiate action, like that man who was sitting and watching golf but could not go and play. This is deeply humbling because it reminds us that drive, motivation, and initiative are biological functions. Human beings do not simply choose vitality at will. Another condition that illustrates this brain's tug of war beautifully is addiction, more clearly than any other condition. The addicted individual often understands consequences perfectly well and yet continues. Why? Because limbic reward systems overpower long-term frontal evaluation. Dopaminergic systems, those that contain dopamine, assign overwhelming salience to reward-related cues. The substance, the behavior, or the experience becomes emotionally prioritized above health and relationships. A recovering alcoholic passes an old bar after months of abstinence. A smell, a song, a familiar street corner, and suddenly craving floods consciousness. Memory, reward, emotion, autonomic arousal, anticipation all activate together, and the frontal systems struggle to maintain restraint. I remember a patient of ours who went and spent a lot of money in a very expensive and exclusive de-addiction center abroad. He left the center and was being driven back to the airport, stopped in a restaurant which also had a bar, and something triggered. The person who had forced himself into abstinence through 3 to 4 months of work gave in just there and was drinking all the way to the airport and all the way back on the plane to India. The entire effort of going to this very exclusive de-addiction center was lost. Grief may be among the most biologically revealing human emotions. Why does a grieving person continue expecting someone who has died? Why do people report hearing footsteps, sensing presence, reaching for the phone? Because your attachment systems remain active and the brain continues predicting the loved one's existence. Grief therefore becomes the painful process through which prediction slowly updates reality, which is why grief feels not merely emotional but disorganizing. Reality itself temporarily destabilizes for the person who is grieving. And perhaps nowhere is the emotional brain more visible than in love. Love radically alters salience. One face becomes neurologically privileged. One voice becomes calming. One absence becomes painful. Your reward hormones, dopamine, oxytocin, attachment systems, memory systems, autonomic regulation all become synchronizing around another human being. And I want to remind you about the podcast on art and love that we did many, many moons ago, where you will find much more about this topic. Love, therefore, changes attention, memory, motivation, prediction, and identity itself. In many ways, attachment becomes biologically embedded meaning. But the brain's tug of war does not merely shape emotion. At times, it reshapes reality itself. And nowhere is this more fascinating than in conditions involving the temporal lobes. And this we will address in the next segment of our podcast. Remember, we are discussing Luria's brain and the different brain systems involved in human emotion. Welcome to the Neurokrish Immersion. We are discussing Luria's brain and the tug of war that goes on. We described the frontal lobes and limbic system in the first part of this podcast masterclass. Now we go to the second part, where we are talking about the temporal lobes. Conditions that involve the temporal lobes are really very, very fascinating. The temporal lobes occupy a remarkable position in the brain. They sit at the intersection of memory, language, emotional salience, autobiographical experience, sensory interpretation, and identity. Deep within them lie structures like the hippocampus, the amygdala, and extensive limbic networks. These are not merely memory systems. Let me discuss how this plays out in clinical practice. Years ago, I encountered a child whose family described him with a remarkable phrase. They said, "Doctor, he has become too philosophical." And this was a 8-year-old child. And what was very interesting to me was that he would go and sit in front of the small altar in his parents' bedroom and pray repeatedly. And he would repeatedly ask questions like, why are we born? What is the purpose of human life? What happens when we die? And this was a child who, until all this started, was quite normal. Now imagine hearing these questions in a neurological clinic. The child had become so intensely preoccupied with these existential questions, excessively reflective, emotionally altered, withdrawn from ordinary childhood engagement. He was no longer playing like he used to. Something profound had shifted. And very, very interestingly, it took admission to hospital for me to notice that he was having partial seizures, which had not revealed themselves. And these were coming from the temporal lobe. So what he had was temporal lobe epilepsy. Certain forms of temporal lobe epilepsy produce remarkable behavioral and emotional changes. Some patients become hyper-religious, intensely philosophical, emotionally viscous. They find it difficult to terminate a discussion or an argument. Hypergraphic, writing endlessly, preoccupied with ethical ideas, with destiny, with meaning, with spirituality. Norman Geschwind was a famous great behavioral neurologist, and he has described this condition, which goes eponymously with his name. It's called Geschwind's syndrome. Some neuroscientists have gone on to describe what they call sensory limbic hyperconnection. And let me describe that to you. Your temporal lobes are the storehouse of your memory and emotion and of salience. And when you have epilepsy, you have excessive electrochemical activity in the very same temporal lobe. And what happens is that ordinary experience acquires extraordinary emotional significance to you. A coincidence starts to feel destined. Music feels overwhelming. Spirituality intensifies. Small events feel cosmically meaningful. The emotional coloring of experience deepens dramatically, and suddenly we begin to understand. Consciousness itself is not passive observation, it's emotionally weighted interpretation. One patient filled notebook after notebook with reflections on morality, philosophy, religion, and destiny. Endless pages, endless associations, endless meaning. Was this pathology? Was it creativity? Was it spiritual transformation? Was it neurological dysregulation? The answer may not be simple because the border between illness and altered consciousness is rather thin. Psychosis may represent one of the most dramatic examples of disrupted meaning attribution. Modern neuroscience increasingly suggests that psychosis involves abnormal salience assignment. In simpler language, the brain begins attaching excessive importance to ordinary stimuli. A stranger's glance becomes loaded with significance. A number plate becomes a message. A television anchor appears to speak directly to the individual. Coincidences stop feeling accidental. Internal imagination begins competing with external reality. Importantly, paranoia is not random irrationality. It is often an emotionally coherent attempt to explain overwhelming salience. The person genuinely feels watched, threatened, targeted, unsafe. The emotional systems activate first. The narrative explanation comes later. This is crucial to understand clinically because psychosis is not simply false belief. The brain is constantly predicting reality. Modern predictive processing models suggest that perception itself is partly constructed internally. Normally, sensory input corrects internal prediction. But when prediction overwhelms sensory correction, internally generated experience may begin to feel extremely externally very real. This may help explain hallucinations. The brain begins trusting internally generated models more than incoming sensory evidence. If I can put that to you a little more simply, you have something like an ego boundary in your brain. This ego boundary is virtual, and if you think about it, it's what gives you that sense of self. What you see as clearly outside that ego boundary is what you consider as an external input, and what you see as being within the ego boundary is what you consider me. In psychosis, if you can understand it, the boundary begins to dissolve, and therefore there is confusion between what is an external sensory output and what is internally generated as a predictive model. From all this we learn something, a very deep lesson in neuroscience. The brain is not a camera, it's a storyteller. It constantly predicts, edits, interprets, colors, and narrates reality. Emotion influences that story profoundly, which means human beings do not experience objective reality directly. We experience emotionally interpreted reality, which is one reason why what we remember is so colored with the emotion that we were feeling at that point in time. Whether the experience is pleasant or unpleasant, threatening or non-threatening, really depends on that. But the same systems that produce pathology may also produce creativity. And some of humanity's greatest artistic, philosophical, and spiritual achievements emerge from minds capable of unusual associative richness. Creativity often requires loosening rigid frontal control, allowing novel association, permitting unexpected connections, tolerating ambiguity. In many ways, creativity lives at the edge of regulation. Let me repeat that. Creativity lives at the edge of regulation. Sit with it. Consider the poet, the composer, the mystic, the painter. They often experience the world with heightened salience. Music becomes emotionally immersive. Metaphor becomes vivid. Symbolism deepens. Inner imagery intensifies. Meaning expands beyond ordinary literal interpretation. The inspired brain therefore represents not the absence of control but flexible interaction. And one very good example of that is Kumagasu Minakata, whom I've talked about in earlier podcasts, the extraordinary Japanese polymath who embodied many of these tensions. Brilliant, obsessive, unconventional, intensely associative, endlessly curious. Minds like his remind us that unusual cognition can produce both suffering and genius. Neurodivergence, creativity, obsession, and emotional intensity often overlap in complex ways. And let me tell you a very interesting side story. Komagasu Minakata's brain was preserved, and in modern science, they managed to do an MRI of the preserved brain, and he had a small right hippocampus. Kumagasu Minakata had temporal lobe epilepsy. He had many features of the Geschwind syndrome. And this tells us a little bit about how important the brain is to both creativity and the human psyche. In recent decades, neuroscience has identified another deeply important system, the default mode network. The network involving medial frontal regions, posterior cingulate systems, angular gyri, autobiographical memory networks. This network becomes active when the mind turns inward during reflection, imagination, remembering. This is profoundly important philosophically because the self may not be a fixed entity. It may instead be an ongoing narrative process. Let me repeat that for you. The self may not be a fixed entity. It may instead be an ongoing narrative process. A continuously updated model integrating memory, prediction, emotion, social identity, and bodily experience, which means the self is not isolated from the brain. But the narrative self is double-edged. It gives continuity, identity, autobiography, and meaning. Yet, it can also generate rumination, anxiety, self-criticism, depressive looping, obsessional thinking. The same network that permits reflection can imprison the mind inside itself. Let me repeat that for you. We're talking about the default mode network here, which gives you the sense of self. The same network that permits reflection can imprison the mind inside itself. And perhaps now we begin to see the deeper picture emerging. Human suffering cannot be fully understood through isolated symptoms alone. Anxiety is not merely fear. Depression is not merely sadness. Addiction is not merely weak will. Psychosis is not merely irrationality. Behavior is not merely morality. Every human experience emerges from interacting systems: arousal, memory, salience. Modern neuroscience, therefore, sometimes risks becoming excessively reductionist. We speak of neurotransmitters, receptors, circuits, lesions, biomarkers. All these matter deeply. But human beings are not merely collections of chemicals. Biology becomes experienced through meaning. A panic attack is not simply adrenaline, it is terror. Grief is not merely attachment circuitry. And throughout history, medicine has repeatedly separated neurology from psychiatry, brain from mind, biology from emotion. But clinical reality refuses to obey these boundaries. A frontal lesion may produce disinhibition resembling mania. Temporal lobe epilepsy may produce mystical experience. Depression alters cognition and movement. The distinction between brain disorder and mind disorder increasingly becomes inadequate. The brain and mind are not opponents, they are different languages describing the same phenomenon. And this is why truly humane neuroscience requires integration. Not merely medication, not merely psychotherapy, not merely rehabilitation, but understanding. The patient with rage may carry trauma within. The patient with apathy may carry frontal dysfunction. The patient with anxiety may inhabit a nervous system trained by uncertainty. The patient with psychosis may be overwhelmed by aberrant salience. The patient with addiction may be trapped in pathological reward learning. Human beings therefore require biological understanding. But perhaps the most important realization is this: these systems are not relevant only to illness. They shape ordinary human life. Every day, human beings negotiate between impulse and restraint, fear and courage, desire and responsibility, attachment and autonomy, emotion and reflection. A parent suppresses anger before speaking to a child. A recovering addict suppresses craving. A grieving person slowly relearns absence. An anxious student challenges catastrophic prediction. A meditator observes thought without reacting. A musician transforms emotion into beauty. A civilization attempts to regulate aggression through law, ethics, ritual, and culture. The tug of war, therefore, exists within individuals, within relationships. And here lies a paradox. The very systems that generate suffering also generate meaning. Without limbic urgency, we would not feel attachment, passion, love, creativity, moral outrage, longing, or transcendence. Without frontal restraint, there would be no civilization. And perhaps this is where neuroscience unexpectedly approaches philosophy. Across contemplative traditions, human suffering has often been understood as reactivity, attachment, compulsive desire, emotional overwhelm, uncontrolled thought. In modern neuroscience, we might describe these differently: salience dysregulation, limbic overactivation. What makes Alexander Luria so important today? It's not merely that he mapped brain function. Many scientists have done that. Luria humanized neuroscience. He recognized that cognition, personality, emotion, memory, behavior, and meaning are all inseparable. He saw patients not as damaged machinery. The brain is not a cold computational machine, nor is the mind some mystical entity floating free of biology. Human beings are embodied emotional systems attempting continuously to regulate instinct, fear, desire, memory, attachment, imagination, and meaning. We are creatures capable of both profound impulsivity and profound reflection, capable of violence and compassion, chaos and restraint, addiction and transcendence. Perhaps the brain's tug of war is not a flaw in human design. Perhaps it's a very condition that makes consciousness, morality, creativity all relevant. Luria once wrote that the brain works not through isolated part, but through functional systems. And in our visual guide, we carry an image of Luria's 3 functional systems, which is what we began with. And maybe the deepest lesson of all this is to understand the human mind, we must understand not only the systems themselves, but the fragile, beautiful, and often painful negotiation between them. This is what it means to be human.